We're going to start with Just Stop Oil. Last week, 5 protesters from the group were jailed because of their involvement in protests that brought part of the M25 to a standstill. That was in 2022. We're particularly interested in this story because a key piece of evidence was a Zoom call recorded by the Sun journalist Scarlett Howes, who had infiltrated the group. The Zoom call showed Just Stop Oil's leader, Roger Hallam, setting out the plan. This is a little bit of it.
If we do it for one day, it's going to be massive, but so what, right? If it goes on for 2 days, it's going to be global news. If it goes to 3-4 days, you're in the ballpark of the biggest disruption in British modern history. We are not going to influence government policy by just going through the motions.
So that was a Zoom call recorded by the Sun journalist, and the Sun was later thanked by the judge in the case. Well, Damien Gayle, the Guardian's climate correspondent, watched the whole trial, and he's here. Damien, thank you for coming on the media show. You described the trial in your reporting as the UK's wildest climate trial. What happened?
Well, it really was like nothing I've ever seen before as a journalist covering court cases, and I've covered quite a few. It all seemed, aside from this remarkable piece of evidence from the Sun, this recording of the 5 defendants making what was effectively a recruitment call to try to enlist people to take part in this protest, the prosecution case ran pretty much as we have come to expect with these climate trials. The defendants didn't contest any of the evidence against them. They effectively did not bother to deny, aside from Roger Hallam, deny that they had taken part in this protest. And it was when the defence started that things started to get really interesting. The defendants decided that they were going to turn the courtroom into a site of civil resistance. And by that they meant that they were going to extend their civil disobedience protests from the streets into the courts. In effect, what this meant was that they were not going to abide by any of the instructions that the judge gave them. And they were going to use the opportunity of being in court as a platform to make their views known about the climate crisis.
So was that essentially them trying to turn it into a media event, more of a media event than it was already? As with a media show, it's sort of interesting to look at it through the lens of the media.
Yeah, these protesters, part of their raison d'etre and the strategy that they use is to gain media coverage for the protests that they do, and in doing so to gain media coverage of the cause that they're espousing. The problem that they had was that the judge had ruled that evidence about climate breakdown was not relevant to the case. And so that put them in conflict with the court from the very beginning. As soon as they started to give their evidence, they wanted to give a case of reasonable excuse and to say that they were justified in doing what it was that they did because the urgency of the climate crisis was so severe that any rational person would have done the same thing if they knew. Now, in effect, what that meant was that when they went into the witness box to give evidence on their own behalf, they immediately started to give evidence which the judge had ruled was out of order and not pertinent to the case.
And were you reporting that? How did your coverage work?
So the judge ruled that they couldn't give evidence about climate change, but as your listeners may well be aware, when it comes to reporting the courts in the UK, we can report pretty much anything that's said in front of the jury. Whenever the jury is not present, we can't report on anything that happens until the conclusion of the trial.
And were there dramatic things happening when the jury weren't present that you then couldn't report on?
Oh, well, yeah. So this conflict that they ended up finding themselves in with the judge, while they were trying to give the jury lectures on the meaning of the law and the reason why they ought to have a reasonable excuse, the judge was getting more and more irate and irritated, sending the jury out, instructing them to keep to the facts of the case as he's determined that they were, until it got to the point where defendants decided that they would refuse to leave the witness box until they'd been allowed to give the evidence which they had come to court to give, and to give the full story which they thought the jury ought to hear.
But the jury weren't there, and you couldn't report this, or how did it work?
It's when they started to give that full story which the judge decided the jury ought not to hear, that he would send the jury out. He then would order them to leave the witness box. They refused, and that's when police started to be called into court.
And you could report that.
No, we
so
can't report that.
Lots that people don't know that happened in this trial that you saw with your own eyes.
Well, that was the amazing thing about reporting it, was that we really couldn't tell. It was this incredibly fascinating trial, and we were all talking about it behind the scenes, but we really couldn't tell the story until it had all finished. And I was
Which
going
is often
there.
the case with court reporting, I suppose. I mean, I've done a lot of court reporting in my time. There's a lot you can't report until the end.
There's a lot you can't report until the end, but there's a lot you can report as the trial progresses. And you get a great sense of the story from being in court because you hear all the evidence that's relevant to the case. You get incredible detail about what's happened, who did what to whom and when, which is so hard to gather as a reporter otherwise. The police have effectively done your job for you. The witnesses are doing your job for you, and you're there in court just faithfully taking it all down and writing it down. But with this case, it was so complicated because the jury were being sent out. I had to judge at which point were the jury no longer able to hear what was being said in the court, so that I could safely report what was being said without putting us at risk of
Breaking the law.
breaking the law. Yeah.
And in terms of your interactions with the protesters, were they getting in contact with you in advance? Were they telling you what they were going to do? Were they, contact you? Were they chatting to you in the corridors of the court while it wasn't sitting? How did that work?
So we had a sense that this was going to be an interesting trial. We prefer not to know the full details of what it is that protesters are going to do before they do them, but they did say to us, come to this trial, it's going to be interesting. It was outside the court that a supporter of these defendants said to me that the plan was to turn the court into a site of civil resistance.
Mm.
Well, Damien, with us here in the Media Show studio is Jack Chapman, who is producer of the recent Channel 4 documentary, Chris Packham, Is It Time to Break the Law?, which grappled with some of the issues that you're raising. Jack, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much indeed. Now, this programme, for people who haven't seen it, was highly authored. It was centred around Chris Packham's perspective. As the producer of it, were you setting out to make a polemic, to build an argument, to do an impartial piece of reporting? What was your brief?
The brief was kind of part polemic and part investigation. So anyone who knows Chris Packham will know that he is fully behind the climate movement and believes the science and believes the government's not doing enough. So that was kind of his starting point. And so in that regard, it was polemic. He was kind of advocating for more action. But assuming you believe the science, it was then investigative in terms of what is legitimate if you believe the science and you believe we're, to quote the UN, sleepwalking into the apocalypse.
And there were questions in Parliament about your programme, about whether Channel 4 should be making a programme that contains this type of polemic around this type of issue. Did you think it was reasonable to ask the question?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. I mean, it's not, Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, they're not niche movements. There's, hundreds, thousands of people who are kind of, acting in this way. So I think it's, I think Channel 4 has a kind of mandate to reflect what's happening in the population. And, is it time to break the law is a kind of justified question. It's something that a lot of people are asking. And
as part of making this programme, you spoke to Roger Hallam. How was it to set up that interview? How was it to record that conversation?
Yeah, it was great. He had a broken leg at the time, so we interviewed him at his house. But yeah, no, we got his contact details through Just Stop Oil kind of press contacts. I had a quick conversation with him beforehand. I did a bit of research into his kind of strategy. He was studying a PhD at King's in civil resistance, civil disobedience for 3 years. So it was, so we just went to his house and they had quite a kind of free-flowing conversation.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. As a producer, how do you approach that when, and I'm not for a minute saying they hold identical views, but they clearly have a shared concern about the environment. How do you approach that as a journalistic exercise when it's a conversation between two people such as Roger Hallam and Chris Packham?
I think you don't shy away from the fact that they have things in common. They weren't going to kind of discuss whether the debate around whether climate change is real. It was going to be very much, Roger is he was one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion. He set up Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain. He is one of the kind of figureheads of the movement.
And when you're making a program like this from a particular perspective, you'll be aware that there may be some people watching who are very sympathetic to Chris Packham, but there are other people who get infuriated by protests that may disrupt their lives in one way or another. How do you build those perspectives in without undermining the premise of the program, which is that it's one person's perspective?
Well, I mean, we went for. We were kind of mandated to look for a range of views. So, we interviewed Lord Peter Lilly, who is a climate lukewarmer. So he thinks Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion are quite ridiculous, and I think he referred to them as a cult. We interviewed Andreas Malm in Sweden, who wrote the How to Blow Up a Pipeline book. He advocates for direct action against oil infrastructure, but he was actually quite critical of Just Stop Oil and their tactics.
Can I just ask you, you were there when Just Stop Oil protesters poured paint on an office building in central London, and you weren't directly involved, but you knew beforehand it was likely to happen. Is that a fair way of putting it? Because you'd spoken to protesters. As a journalist, how do you handle that kind of information if you get it?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there personally on that shoot, but the way the protocol that we set up was we said to Just Stop Oil, we'd like to be there to film one of your actions, and they would give us kind of very broad sort of dates.
Even if those actions might break the law.
Even if those actions would break the law, yeah. But we had to be very careful. We had kind of very direct guidance from Channel 4 about how to approach this. So we had no information about the specifics of what the action would be beforehand. We were just told to turn up at a place at time, given a few days' notice so we could get a camera crew together. But yeah, no, we didn't know anything about what was going to happen until we arrived on the day.
This is Jack Chapman, who's describing the programme he produced for Channel 4, a documentary titled Chris Packham, Is It Time to Break the Law?
I just want to put this in context now, though, and talk about how the media impacts the debate around climate action, after we've just been talking to you two about exactly that. But bringing in Meera Selva, the founder of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. Broadly for you, Meera, hello. What do you make of how the media covers Just Stop Oil?
I think there's two issues here, which is how you cover the climate issue, and then how you cover protests. And they're both really important, because Wolfgang Blau and I co-founded the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, recognising that the climate crisis is more than something that can be covered just by the climate editor or the environmental editor of any newsroom. It's now so vast that it has to bring in politics, transport, social policy, and economic journalism.
And we've had Wolfgang on the show talking about exactly that.
Absolutely.
Several months ago.
And so the key point here is that's the point the Just Stop Oil protesters are really making. They're saying the climate crisis is coming for all of us. It's going to disrupt all our lives. What we're doing is giving us a taste of this. So I understand the framing of the issue. There is a separate issue of that it's hugely disruptive to people's lives and nobody likes the disruption. I think there's a problem with journalism at the moment in that it is not seen as a neutral party in many of these polarizing issues. It's seen as journalists are seen as actively siding on with one side or the other. And I think both the actions of the undercover journalists kind of reinforce that, and then possibly the kind of close access to the movements like Just Stop Oil also reinforce that. You could argue that if you've got both journalists doing both, they're safe, but in reality I think it undermines journalism overall. And if you think about the fact that climate journalists in many parts of the world come under direct attack for their work, are really one of the most endangered people when they come to kind of reporting, it can be really pernicious and undermine the credibility of journalism.
And we were just talking to Damien Gayle from The Guardian about the specifics around the trial that he covered, and the jailing of those 5 Just Stop Oil protesters and the Sun's involvement in it.
Yeah.
What did you make of the Sun's role in the trial?
I think undercover journalism needs to be done with very clear ethical frameworks and clear sense of purpose of why you're doing it. And it's usually justified when you're being given access to people or institutions you would not otherwise have access to, whether that's prime ministers, royal families, kind of really high closed institutions. It's hard to justify infiltrating civil society movements that are fairly porous. The fact that he could just log on to this journalist, she could just log on to the Zoom call and participate means that they're not sealed spaces. when you consider the Met Police went undercover in the 90s with and with social movements, and there was a huge scandal about this because it's a betrayal of trust. And I think
So are you saying that the Sun shouldn't have done it? 'Cause obviously the judge thanked the Sun for doing it.
I do think, I'm not going to go into the legalities of it. I can understand why the judge thanked the Sun, and the judge seemed to be getting more and more irate with the climate protesters because they are disrupting his courtroom. So I fully understand why that happened. But there need to be spaces you can talk about the climate crisis, and if you can't speak about them in the media, in court cases, in Parliament, people speak about them elsewhere on private messaging, in other parts of the internet, and that's often where you get a huge amount of disinformation, polarizing coverage that's really disruptive.
Well, on the Sun's decision to carry out its reporting in this nature, we got in touch with the Sun and it sent us a comment saying it's always been the job of the free press to expose wrongdoing. The planned disruption was against the law. Scarlet House's investigation into the Just Stop Oil protests saw the protesters receive record prison sentences. The protest resulted in chaos, with drivers experiencing huge delays, meaning they missed vital appointments at massive cost to them and public services. The judge said in court that the reporter and the newspaper did entirely the right thing by passing the recording on to the police, as they have crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic. We fully stand by the right to publish the investigation, holding groups accountable for their actions. What do you think to that, Meera?
I think if they're holding that group accountable for their actions, that's excellent. It'd be good to ensure that they're also holding the fossil fuel industry accountable for their actions, governments accountable for their actions on climate change as well. I know they did write an editorial saying we recognise the issue of the climate crisis. We think this was about exposing wrongdoing and breaking the law and civil disruption, as long as that kind of accountability piece works in all directions.
And I should add that as well as the Sun sending us a comment, we did invite the journalist who did this report, Scarlett House, onto the programme, but she wasn't available. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Meera Selva, founder of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, Jack Chapman, producer of Chris Packham, Is It Time to Break the Law, and Damien Gayle, the climate correspondent of The Guardian.